My name is Randa Abdel-Fattah. I'm 32. I'm an Australian-born Muslim Palestinian Egyptian, which is quite a mouthful. I work as a lawyer, but my real passion is writing, and I enjoy writing children's books, young adult fiction, and a little bit of adult fiction as well. I've always been interested in how the media's sort of preoccupation with Muslims and Islam and its tendency to discuss and sort of negotiate Muslims as somehow negotiable citizens, very often the country in which they were born and raised. I've always been interested in how that impacts on young people. And myself having what I call a hyphenated identity, you can't help but define your identity in terms of resistance. And now I've come to terms with that, and I'm in a place now where I don't feel the need to always be defining myself in terms of other people's prejudices. But it worries me that young people who haven't had the experience and maturity to be able to come to that realization, how they deal with that. And so I just feel this, I suppose, impulse to write from the point of view of a young person. It's all very vivid to me still, what it felt like growing up, having to try and work out who you are, but having this burden of always defending yourself against people's misunderstandings and misconceptions. And I really wanted to give a voice to what I feel is a group of people who often don't have a platform and whose voices are often either stifled or people talk on their behalf. And I wanted to put a microphone in front of them and say, this is your chance to give your alternative narrative. I wrote the first draft of Does My Head Look Big in This when I was 15. I was in year 9, and I felt very passionate about being an Australian Muslim girl who felt a sense of being misunderstood by the wider community because of my beliefs, and also because I wore the hijab as part of my school uniform. And I felt compelled to write a book that would somehow allow readers to look past the veil and sort of see the person within and realise it wasn't a walking headline, it wasn't a walking stereotype. And I wrote the first draft and sent it to publishers, and they were interested in the concept but ultimately turned it down. They felt it was a bit too didactic and preachy. When I returned to write it, I had started practicing as a lawyer in 2003. I went back and read the first draft, and it was sort of like the angry rantings of a teenager. And I thought this time I was going to do something different, which was use humour. And I really wanted to write a funny book about just an average Australian Muslim girl who is trying to negotiate her place in the world, figure out the age-old question, who am I? But at the same time, she's got the added burden of having to deal with people's prejudices because of her decision to wear the veil while she's at a snotty private school in Melbourne. So I guess it's a book about her longing to belong and to be accepted for who she is. After I wrote Does My Head Look Big in This, the issues thrown up by identity confusion and identity politics was still something I was deeply interested in. And having moved from Melbourne to Sydney, I felt there was a different dynamic to multiculturalism in Sydney. And so I wanted to write a book that explored a character who didn't have the strength of conviction that Amal does in Does My Head Look Big in This. Somebody who was a lot more confused by her identity, almost felt her identity hyphens were a burden. And so I wrote 10 Things I Hate About Me, looking at what it meant to be Lebanese in Sydney, but also a book that I suppose resonates with anybody who comes from a mixed heritage, how to straddle between different worlds and negotiate an identity free from other people's expectations and traditions. And so I wrote 10 Things I Hate About Me. And after that, I really felt very passionate about wanting to explore the Israeli occupation from the point of view of a child. And I suppose it's a story that I've written because of my heritage as the daughter of a dispossessed Palestinian, and it's a subject that I'm deeply passionate about. And so I wrote Where the Streets Had a Name, looking at the occupation from the point of view of a young, a 13-year-old girl growing up in occupied Bethlehem. And after those 3 books, I felt, wow, that's quite weighty topics. Even though I tried to use humour and sort of inject comedy into those topics, I felt that I wanted to do something different and also challenge myself. So I wrote Noah's Law, which is a legal thriller, and the protagonist this time is a 16-year-old boy, and I had a lot of fun with that. Those are my first 4 young adult novels, and since then I've written for children as well. It's a junior fiction, Buzz Off and the Friendship Matchmaker, which was enormous fun to write. And now I'm doing that. I've got the sequel to the Friendship Matchmaker that's coming out next year, and I've got a 4-book children's series I'm about to start, and my first adult book, which was also enormous fun to write. It's called No Sex in the City, which is a spin on sort of the traditional chick lit with a Muslim twist. I think that the way you overcome preachiness when you're talking about topics such as prejudice and racism and the Israeli occupation and such weighty topics is to forget that you're actually looking at such weighty subject matter and focus on the human intimacies, relationships, human nature, the fleeting moments that pass between characters, the monumental events in their lives to the very significant and insignificant. And when you take an interest in human beings for who they are, not how they're somehow going to fit into your wider message, I think that's how you can overcome a didactic tone, bringing down your story. I hope with my writing I'm able to get people thinking about their perhaps misconceptions and prejudgments, and I also like to challenge people's idea of what it means, what we mean when we say mainstream. When we have a Muslim voice, is it some deviation from the norm, or can we accept that Muslim voices contribute to the mainstream space and are part of the mainstream? And we've seen that's happening a lot more now. We're seeing more comedians and artists and writers and poets and poetry slam artists and people who are using something that's potentially quite negative, which is the stereotyping and prejudice, and channeling that anger into something positive and creating. And I think that's really exciting, and something that's really gives you a lot of hope about what Muslims are going to bring to Australia. Well, when I first started more actively in human rights activism, it was during my university years. I was working with asylum seekers at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre in Melbourne. I was working to help recent refugees try to settle into Australia, just basically trying to negotiate their way around the social services and finding a house and all the things we take for granted. And slowly my human rights work has been more about writing and using a platform in the media when I have the chance to try and raise awareness about topics and issues that often don't get enough attention, or often don't have that voice given due attention. And we often hear, particularly when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we don't often hear the Palestinian point of view. We don't hear it enough. We're hearing it a lot more now. But when I first started, it was very difficult to even get an editor to entertain the idea of having a Palestinian write an opinion piece. We're getting more space now. There's still a long way to go. But that's what I try and do, use my writing and my media interviews to bring across a voice that's often stifled. One of the things I hope to achieve when I have the opportunity to write in mainstream media is to counter a lot of the misconceptions about Muslims and Islam, about Palestine and about refugees, and provide an alternative voice. I don't ever represent myself as the Muslim voice. I'm not speaking on behalf of a monolithic community, and I suppose part of my writing is to try and reinforce the idea that there are many voices within the Muslim communities, that we are a diverse community, and that there is a necessity to allow access to the mainstream media to those voices, rather than constantly having the stereotypical voices that we hear time and time again, and give space to other people's viewpoints. I suppose it's because we feel there's a tension. On the one hand, we see that there's a preoccupation in the media with anything to do with Muslims. There's almost a consistent campaign amongst some media outlets of demonizing Muslims and projecting them in this one-dimensional caricature. And on the one hand, you don't want to engage with that, you want to ignore it. but by the same token, you need to provide a rebuttal. And so this is the tension that we find ourselves in. Islam to me is many things. First and foremost, it's about a relationship with God. It's, for me, first and foremost, something that feeds my spirituality. And I believe that having that God consciousness and that one-to-one relationship with God in turn affects my lifestyle, the choices that I make, my sort of code of ethics, the way that I interact with people, the way that I go about my work, my citizenship, my morality and ethics. But it's always because I've got this spiritual relationship with God, this sense that God is watching over me and that I'm accountable to God. That provides a really great comfort to me, and in turn it affects my lifestyle and my choices. It's ironic, but people often see being Muslim and Australian as somehow mutually exclusive, but I really believe that if I am practicing my faith to the best of my ability, then really what I'm trying to be is the best human being I can be, the most ethical person that I can be, and that surely makes for a more productive and citizen, and that's what I try to do with Islam. I think with my fashion style, I always try to dress modestly, and of course that poses challenges in summer, and I think now it's never been an easier time to dress modestly. There's a lot more choice out there. It's not just the ugly clothes that are modest as it was when I was growing up, but there's far more choice. And it's not just that you have to go to certain boutiques. You can find longer skirts and clothes that meet your standards of modesty in more mainstream stores as well. And I try as much as I can to dress in a way that makes me feel comfortable. I'm not the sort of person who follows fashion strictly. I just wear what I feel comfortable in, that meets my own standards of modesty and makes me feel good as well. Dressing modestly or immodestly is irrelevant to how men react to you and how they behave. And I think that there's a real separation between how a woman dresses and men behaving badly, if you like. I think that can be a misconception amongst Muslims and non-Muslims, that somehow the way I dress is going to be part of the responsibility of how a man behaves and treats me. I think when you dress modestly, you do it for yourself, and you do it because you have a certain code of dress that's informed by your own religious choices and the way that you make sense of your own religious teachings. When I dress modestly, I'm not doing it because I don't want men to look at me. I'm doing it because it makes me feel comfortable to dress in this way. I don't believe that if I dress modestly, a man is necessarily only going to respect me for my mind and not my body. I used to say that at the time that I used to wear the veil, that wearing a head veil, scarf would automatically make a man respect me for my mind and not my body. I think that gives a lot of way too much benefit of the doubt to men as well, and also again connects my dress with men's actions. And I think that we need to be clear that you can be dressed from head to toe and still be treated as a sex object. Ultimately, they are two separate issues, and it absolves men of their guilt if we put the responsibility back on how women dress. Ultimately, when I dress modestly, I do it because it's a personal choice. I will decide what is shown in the public space and what isn't, and I think, frankly, it's nobody else's business why I do it. Our fashion sense and the choices that we make when we dress, as to how we dress, it can become quite draining, how there is this constant preoccupation at the expense of who we are and what we're doing and what we want to achieve. To constantly have a focus on our dress as something that defines us can be quite frustrating. At the same time, I suppose the flip side of that is that more and more people are recognizing that we are making our own choices, that we're not being forced to dress in a certain way to appease a male guardian, that these are choices that we make and that we're embracing modesty and having fun with it. And I think that's really exciting, that we can create this space where our choices aren't belittled, that they're actually now respected, and we can talk about them comfortably and freely and be given respect, for making these choices.